Thad and I want to say is thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the conversations we've had, for engaging as colleagues in this enterprise. There's a whole lot on the table. You all provided rich drafts in different places, some longer than the length, some shorter, but all have a great idea at the core. So we appreciate that. And along those lines, I just wanted to remind you that we look forward to continuing to work with you and appreciate your responsiveness to deadlines and submissions and review and so forth. We may have to send the manuscript out to some outside reviewers. I understand that it's always been a friendly process and no threats that you change this or else, but there may be some good collegial suggestions. Thad and I will, of course, read the whole manuscript and ask perhaps for some, well, first for the ideas that you have for your own revisions, but perhaps some revisions for a sense of connectedness of the volume, to maybe to tie into some of the other things you've heard or the essays you've read. But of course, it's up to you to how much you want to go into new material here. And many of you have worked in this area a long time and want to stick with ideas you've already presented, and that's great. But we just ask you to keep thinking about that and to respond to deadlines. Tammy Tripp is with us, and she's the editorial person at Jepson who will be working on keeping us all on task and together. And she's a great editor, but not a meddler. Is that a good way to put it?
I try not to be.
But a very talented person who actually took some classes with Dr. Peters, I believe. Is that right?
They both graduated from our program.
So, thank you. And Gil, thanks for being with us for the whole conference. That's great too.
Thank you all for coming. This is great.
Doug, I certainly can't speak for the group, but I know from previous experience it's helpful if you, as editor, might be given the authority or just take it up. I'd certainly grant it to suggest when you actually do some editing of the text, places where references to other papers might work very nicely. Because you're going to see the big picture one more time, or two more times, or three more times. And the most of us have read them all once, and aren't going to read them all again. So you may be able to see some connections that we don't think of, and I empower you, from at least from my paper, to make suggestions about naming the connections.
We will. Thank you. And the other thing is that the order of the papers for this conference may well not be the order or the structure for the papers for the book. But I'm guessing that it won't be, because there are many other ways to cut this material, and to hear the perspectives already makes me think about different ways we could revise it. And perhaps you all want to do something significantly different or build on some mention of what you've done, or cut according to what you've heard. So,
not picking on anything.
And so just another practical matter, very different vein. We really are going to wrap up at 5:30 sharp, because the dinner at La Mer starts at 6 o'clock sharp downtown. And to my knowledge, there are 2 Five Diamond restaurants in the state of Virginia. One's in Little Washington, and I believe the other one is La Mer. So we want to celebrate with you the work that you've done, and you're coming. I also am very aware of how privileged we all are to do what we do and to get a chance to talk about ideas for a living and to create stuff and to talk, even as we talk about severe poverty and climate change and some other serious questions of deprivation and suffering. And so we've got to live with that tension. But we want to celebrate with you the work that you've done.
So you did get some tension into it, right?
Hell yeah.
If you're a 3-star restaurant, we got a 5-star. Now we got to live with that tension.
You'll have to suffer all night long.
We don't want any suffering. Thad and I have put together some questions as we've read the drafts and thought through the sessions yesterday and today. This is very low tech. There's not even any color or cool graphics like what he had, or I mean, you had like multiple colors and there's a black background and such. But we wanted to just raise a few questions.
Yeah, and partly some of these fall in the category of things we were putting in our paper, we had gotten around to get in the paper, and partly things in the category of the fact that obviously we have 10 really good people, but there's more than 10 dimensions of the things we're talking about, so we have to possibly cover everything. And everything just is very obvious we're saying, obviously this conference is from, you know, the perspective of developed nations and represents the English-speaking world, and clearly this discourse on global justice, to be global, has to engage other people. We have to, I mean, I don't know anything what people in China are saying about this, or, you know, it's folks in Latin America, India, but that's beyond our capacity, but it's obviously it's worth just acknowledging that, acknowledging our limitations, what we can do here. But the first category was question about transnational institutions, and some discussion, obviously, the World Trade Organization and the World Bank and the UN came up a couple of times. But I think there's still a lot to be said about what the role of larger NGOs, international NGOs, are in this discussion about global justice. There's room for much more thinking about the UN. And also the question that comes up about is the right strategy letting multilateral organizations form for their own reasons, which may not be justice motivated, and then trying to reform them, as your paper talked about, and you know, following on Nagel's view, you know, and also Matthias's paper. Personally, I have some questions about that, in the sense that maybe there's a danger these things get structured from the start so as to preclude any kind of justice consideration. And it would seem to be much better if we could somehow get a justice motivation, acknowledging that it's never going to be wholly about justice when we think about constructing new institutions. Second, there was discussion of transnational corporations, but I don't think anyone mentioned capitalism as a system as such, and you know, you're allowed to say capitalism at the University of Richmond. And that may be worth thinking about. You know, the hardcore Marxian objection to all of this would be that capitalism has its own internal logic, and you can't put band-aids on it, and you can't put nice-sounding forms of justice on it. And I think that sort of skeptical position is worth always keeping in mind. You know, sort of the null option, so to speak. The third thing, the question, the role of the U.S. certainly was touched on, but I don't think any of the papers, with maybe Steve's exception, address the U.S. as you know, really being the lead movers, or the the leading imperial power, as it were, and sort of often the power with the capacity to checkmate movement on global justice, and that in turn raises the often depressing question about what about American domestic politics, and what about the difficulties that, for instance, the 2004 Bush-Kerry debates, where Kerry, perhaps the slip of his tongue, talked about a global test in one of the debates, and then got hammered on it, even though, actually read Madison talks about a global test, but the hostility within much of American political culture to any kind of internationalism, or any kind of view that we should moderate our own interest with respect to that of the world opinion, or the interests of others. That's clearly, I think, an obstacle that has to be wrestled with. Another question would be a question about regionalism, and the question can.
Next page.
That's the next page? Okay.
So another question here is the one of smaller nation states and their voice. And Matthias talked about, for instance, talking about reforming the WTO to assure that the global justice pragmatic solution of cobbling together these transnational organizations doesn't leave out the agency or discount the agency of the developing world and of the less powerful countries. So how do we continue, even as we talk about the disproportionate role, and perhaps as realists, as we were going to talk about in a second, of the larger nations, how do we continue to talk about the agency of individuals in poorer countries, but also of nation states per se? I'd make one more point on the U.S. question, something I've written about with Mark Valeri, and that's the question: how can we justify, or to what extent can we justify American exceptionalism in terms of being exceptional in order to help the least well off? In particular, this discourse in terms of the crisis about saving the American economy. And Obama evoked City on the Hill, and we're the hardest working people on earth and everything else. But the part of the moral argument there was that we needed to save the American economy because the most vulnerable in the world are the ones who would be most vulnerable in the global recession. So the question of when exceptionalism is justified in order to help the least well off, or is that just too much tension there for the room?
Right, another question would be, the form of internationalism that's talked about in Andrea's paper, Internationalism. The question of, is that possible in other regions of the world? And in particular, is it possible in situations where there are severe asymmetries of power and wealth? You know, could Canada, Mexico, and the United States have a form of NAFTA that was modeled off the EU? Or does it require a certain limited inequalities in the background to make something like the EU workable? That seems like an important question to keep thinking about.
And this regionalism, bilateralism question was interesting to me at a different level, and that was, again, the Matthias discussion with Dan and others about the WTO as a universal arbiter or umpire of global trade, but also the question of bilateral agreements in that same context. In what ways is this just path dependence and we deal with what we've got? Or what ways do we think about appropriate networks, both in the economic sphere and in the political sphere at more local levels, as a way of building global justice? We had so little discussion of the fully global level in the political order, and almost none of you mentioned the UN, and there's a reason for that. We don't talk about global governance that way, but similarly with economic arrangements, perhaps bilateralism and regionalism is where the action is, as a couple of you have said, and not the more global INGOs and global IFIs.
Yeah, and I guess the second bit about the global consciousness, this has to do about what cultural norms and beliefs about the world would need to evolve to make arguments about global justice effective. In other words, the question, how do you build an audience for discourse about global justice, especially in cases where the audience isn't built in, so to speak. It has to be, in a sense, actually created.
A number of you talked about that explicitly. Jillian mentioned it. Toddy's paper is fundamentally about that. Others see the value of it or the fundamental importance of it, but didn't talk about it directly. But I think we all would assume that it's important that we change our mind. We understand a global economy, but how do we think about global obligations and global justice?
Okay, and we're on to pragmatism. Yeah, and I don't think any of the papers really took on a hardcore realist position that simply says that groups are selfish, countries are selfish, that morality is something that individuals are capable of, that the groups are inherently self-interested. Not that the position is right, but it seems like, again, like a null option that is always, a possibility that has to be wrestled with seriously. But then, if you're going to make an argument about as Jillian did, that some of these things in movement global justice can be consistent with self-interest often, then there becomes a question of to what extent are publics or democratic publics capable of recognizing the long-term self-interest. To me, that's where leadership naturally has a role in helping facilitate that process. And then finally, the question about, we've had a lot of talk about non-ideal theory and partial compliance and so forth. But and as academics, have been taught theories of justice, I think many of us gravitate to the Rawlsian language as a default familiar language. But what about, is that really the best grounding for a theory of justice that is capable of being endorsed by publics in a variety of international settings, given how controversial it is even at the domestic level? I mean, it may be that there's something better out there, or and it's still superior in lots of obvious ways to straightforward utilitarianism. But should we continue to think of that as a default, or should we go to some other view? Matthias's paper obviously would be a contribution in the direction would identify multiple grounds of justice. But that's just another thought that came up from reading the papers.
And that is where I think a lot of the energy is in bringing leadership into the discussion. How do we move from our thinking about theories of justice into the practice? How do we realize some of these great ideas that we have? Even Rawls himself rejected the original position argument as the first order way to talk about international justice. He assumed, did that at the domestic level, but then you assume these nation states who then have obligations out to the globe. So how do we think about that and some of these practical questions of implementation? I do, as I said yesterday, I think leadership is also about how we conceptualize these theories, how we get people to talk about what justice is. And I was interested, you said, Toddy, that you don't think most Americans have a theory of justice. One of my colleagues, Crystal Hoyt, is a social psychologist, and her whole work is on the implicit theories that people carry around, that we all have implicit theories of leadership, of race and gender, and I think she would say justice as well. But how do we think about leadership as a way of getting people to talk about that? The theoretical, what would justice look like to you beyond this merry group of philosophers and political scientists to a broader public, and then how would we implement it? So that brings us to the question of leadership. What processes and challenges would we are required in order to achieve some partial movement towards global justice? And go ahead.
Yeah, well, one obvious question is to what extent should our favorite character, which is the ethically motivated politician, to what extent should such a person be authorized to go beyond preferences of the Democratic public, so maybe in some cases far beyond? Is that when is that justified? And maybe there are situations in which that leadership is necessary. It may be necessary for leaders to violate in some ways the compact they have with their own citizenry on behalf of some global a global sense of justice.
On that, I had a student write a very nice honors thesis a few years ago. She went on to Harvard Law School, did well there. But her argument was that with the crisis in Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda, that U.S. citizens were accountable, partly blameworthy for the situation. But the argument was that leaders have to take signals from their own constituencies, and leadership is consequential, as they have to produce results for their own people, their own group. And the only way to get interests beyond the community into the equation for leadership is for citizens to signal that it's in their own interest. As Smith started the theory of moral sentiments, that our interests, we derive pleasure from seeing others be well off as well. But if citizens had signaled to Clinton and even given him cover to do some more in Rwanda, it would have made a difference. So how do we think about that in terms of these global obligations? That ties into the global consciousness of citizens and other things.
Yeah, and then there's also what we might call the Obama question, which used to be the Blair question. It's sort of when you have a powerful person who has done many nice things and then is forced to backtrack. To what extent does responsibility fall on that individual person, and to what extent does responsibility fall on the citizens to respond when the leader is forced to backtrack? I mean, it seems like a very live question here.
And then a point we had thought about before yesterday, except to see that it was so present in Dan Finn's paper, but so many of you talked about questions related to power. You used language of influence, language of pressure, language of sanctions, and we talked yesterday about how we had a definitional issue here. What do we mean by coercion? Is it a normative term or a descriptive term? Is it always bad, or can it be good? But we agreed that there's a question of influence, and then there's the normative question about whether that influence is positive or negative. We talked about Nye's hard power and soft power distinction. But we're all trying to influence people to work towards global justice in different conceptions. But this analysis of power is fundamental. We're not the first ones to think of it. You could argue that political science wouldn't even exist without that central concept. But perhaps we could do some more common work thinking about that. Nobody mentioned Foucault. You mentioned fields of power, like magnetic fields, but there are all these other kind of postmodern conceptions of how these cameras in here influence us and what we talk about, even if there's nobody watching us. There might be. Didn't mean to raise that after the fact.
My mom will be watching us.
From Brian's question.
Hi, Brian. And then the last slide, and then we want to open it up. Go ahead.
This question is, what is the nature of global justice? Is it relationships between nation states? Or is it relationships between nation states and various transnational bodies? transnational bodies themselves, or is it, is the analysis really individual persons who happen to have nations attached to them? Another question about how do other species fit into this picture, as well as the environment itself. This comment before, it's worth harping again. Who is the audience for discourse on global justice? To throw a Bev Harrison-ism out there, who are we accountable to in our work as academics? What communities are we accountable to? Why are we doing what we're doing? And it could be citizens, could be leaders, could be the people who are designing international institutions. But it seems like very worth trying to be explicit about that. It may be different for different folks among us.
Then there's the question of the forms of justice. Which kind are we talking about? In Catholic social thought and others, there's a distinction between commutative justice, distributive justice, and social justice, which I interpret to talk about the contribution, creating a situation where people can make a contribution. But like I think of Wahid's paper, was your paper fundamentally about commutative justice of the exchange, or as you talk about these different actors, is there more going on about distribution of at least responsibilities, if not benefits? How do we think, is there a new vocabulary we're developing for the forms of justice? And then along this, in terms of these foundational questions of the nature of justice, there's a difference of vocabulary that you all use, cosmopolitanism, and I haven't even had a cosmopolitan yet, and globalism, I think, were largely synonymous in the conference. And then the statism or pro-nationalist vision, I think you use, there's that. But the intermediate terms, I think you use provincial globalism. That's a nice effort, right, Jennifer? You talked about internationalism as some kind of intermediate. And we're not going to do it before 5:30, but I wonder if you mean the same things, or if those are different intermediate positions, or they're overlappings and so forth. And then finally, it's a question of justice and well-being. What does justice require? What are the substantive, are there minimums that we want all human beings to have? So what are the conceptions of well-being behind that? What's the currency, currency that we're talking about here? Is it utilities? I don't think anybody embraced that per se here. Is it income and wealth? Probably not. Is it basic needs? Is it capabilities? Human rights was another currency we talked about. Rawls talks about the primary goods, resources, etc. And you talked about stuff and interest. Those both figure in a person's well-being in their different discourses. So
agency too.
Right. And so you get to justice, well-being, and agency, and then you have different ways to talk about agency. There's, we could have actually done these 4 slides opposite, started with this one. These are some of the foundational questions, then talked about leadership and power, then talked about these questions up to who the actors are. But we didn't watch this study. So we really did want to take just a few minutes to try to map the terrain. There are lots of different ways. One question we have for you is, how would you map the terrain? Or a different way, what connections did you see across your papers and so on?
Something I see missing that was implicit, I think, in several was democracy and justice. What kind of justice presuppositions that are involved in democratic governance, and then on the other side, how much can we expect of the theory of justice prior to communities democratically forging their own conception of justice? So you get a Sen Nussbaum debate here about constitutions versus democratic processes as generating justice. And I also think that some of Matthias's description or concept of democracy as an accountability mechanism was interesting and connects up with the justifiability of democracy in relation to questions of justice.
What other thoughts, connections, ideas do you have? I mean, I'll also mention practically, we're looking for organizing principles for the book. We could do it. I would mention what Dan did. I don't think we'll do it for this paper, but this book could. Dan edited a volume with speakers at a conference. He actually you ready for this, everybody sitting down? I said, we're probably not gonna do this. He chopped up people's papers, it's probably a more elegant way to put it, but when they talked about justice, they went in a justice chapter, and when they talked about well-being, they went in the well-being chapter. So we organized thematically, but didn't say Steve's paper's about climate change, it's also about moral courage. And so they divided, but if you have organizing ideas or complaints for the book, it would be good for you to jump in now too.
Preemptive strikes.
I guess, I mean, so this isn't like a complaint or anything, but there's two other issues. One is how does justice values relate to other values, like in the last session, solidarity as well as democracy. It's a truism in political philosophy that since 1971, all we talk about is justice, justice, justice. But if you spoke to 17th century writers, they would talk about humanity and benevolence as well as justice. So that's one, and the other one is it's a methodological question. Various people in this room have written about it, which is, do you do it, as I'd call it, isolationist way, or do you do it in an integrated way? And it sounds like an arcane philosophical dispute, but it actually has huge practical significance.
Yeah.
So I think it's sort of implicit in practice-driven approach Andrea taking, and the way Matthias reasons is different from the way other people reason. So at both principle and practical level, it has big, major repercussions. So it's already a huge, tall order, I should say. I mean, that's my other comment, is to do all this in less words than Andrea.
No, but to follow up on that, I mean, on this distinction, I think it is an important distinction. It's kind of an organizing distinction between isolationists or integrationists, because there's two different levels, right? So you could be an isolationist, integrationist, that's one dimension, but with respect to the issue area, right? So there's a climatic change,
Right.
But you could also, there's also the same distinction at a higher level with regards to articulating various principles. So you think of principles as articulable in isolation from, well, our values is articulable in isolation from other values.
Right.
Or do you think of them as you need to have a kind of all things considered view in which there's a balance among different values, and the task of the philosopher is to find the balance. So there's, it's like both levels.
Absolutely.
But it's hard to draw the distinction. We've just drawn it in one way, but it's still lush. I mean, it's worth thinking about a clear way of drawing that twofold.
Also, can I just add,
distinction?
just one look on what I call integrationism. There's variations within that. So under one, you just have a master principle, set of principles, and everything's subsumed under that. So if you're a utilitarian, there's no such principle of health justice except at a very derivative level. So that's a subsuming approach. Another one says you should have a principle for X in conjunction with some other view. So if you take speeding, you might say someone should pay a fine, except unless that pushes them beneath the poverty level. It's not that somehow there's some utilitarian theory which just covers everything. It's more you do something in the light of other principles. And so it's very hard to, as you can say, the way I'm struggling to articulate it, a lot of hangs on it, but the way you formulate it is really quite challenging.
So I understand what we've done here, and as Thad and I edit the volume and write at least an introduction, and we've got to figure out how much we're going to do beyond that. But it's not to solve the question or to argue for the integrationist view, and certainly not for the utilitarian, maybe for the capabilities approach. But just kidding. But to map out these questions for people and to say, here are well-trained, thoughtful people, that's us, who have these debates, and these are the important questions that you need to work out and pursue. So, Julie.
If I could introduce a note of hopefully creative tension. I'm a little bit disappointed that we haven't spoken more about leadership. We've spoken a lot about global justice, and we can certainly do more of the work of mapping connections, but I want to talk more about leadership. I was hoping to learn more about global leadership, and I haven't heard enough, and I'm intrigued, and I motivated to work more on this topic. And I was hoping to learn, for instance, what leadership was, and I was delighted to learn in your promotional material that apparently it is to persuade people to achieve goals. At least that's what you say. Which sounds like, well, don't you always do that all the time? But anyhow, if that's really what leadership is, we need to persuade people to achieve goals. I don't think we've done enough of that kind of work in the kinds of theorizing that we've done. Maybe we need to take it down a notch or up a notch or sideways a notch. But it seems to me that if we're trying to persuade people to achieve goals, we need to come up with different kinds of arguments and different kinds of strategies and think more about things like the sorts of problems Steve was talking about this morning. You know, how do you create moral courage? How do you inspire and so forth? I actually sort of disagree a little bit with your student that you were just using as a model that, you know, you need a sign from the people, but actually it goes both ways. Shouldn't leaders need to help create the motivation so that people feel this is, or create the motivation so that people see this as something they ought to do, even if when they don't give the sign. So there's a different kind of conversation as well that should happen, not different, better, worse, but just another one that should also happen about creating institutional structures and incentives and reasons why people should care about leadership and more that kind of persuading. How do you do that? And not just strategic. I mean, we're talking about the ethically motivated politician. So we want moral arguments, but ones that hopefully converge with prudential considerations and skillful institutional design and other creative mechanisms. So I could say more about that, but that's hopefully my note of creative occasion.
I think this is great. It's very well taken, and I think that's right. That on this question, the creative leader, I obviously think a lot of the American context is going to be someone who can inject an ethical note into a complex argument that's going to appeal to many different pieces. And so, I guess Steve sort of, in our interview yesterday, had a little crack on people who talk about climate change as a jobs program, right? But I think it's good if you make the argument for climate change as a jobs program, because it does help build a constituency. And likewise, the economist John Romer came down to Richmond for a different program and basically argued that using cost-benefit analysis, using utilitarianism, with some slight adjustments to people's, to extent people consume education and leisure as opposed to material goods, that we could adjust to global warming with, and actually be better off in utilitarian terms 50 years down the road. And obviously there are all kinds of assumptions and so forth. But I think the logic of it is something too, that if you can show that the task for leadership has to be showing people the alternative is actually be better for them on multiple dimensions, not just that you're going to be paying more taxes. It's going to be, not that it's going to be the sour oil of justice that you're forced to drink, but it's actually going to be better for you. It's a more positive possibility. So I think there has to be an artistic element too to creating this image of a more positive future, and that's one of the disappointments from Obama, because you go back to his inaugural address, there was a lot of that kind of stuff, and I was like, oh, it's all been sunk in almost into the narrow confines of two-party politics. But that'd be my from the gut reaction. But thanks for raising that, and there's certainly room for more discussion in the 20 minutes we have left.
In a practical sense, the notion of leadership is a process by which leaders and followers come together, motivate each other, communicate with each other to achieve some common goal that has to be arrived at, shaped, so forth. Is some generic definition of leadership, but this idea of leaders within that process of being particularly charged to shape the conversation, to set an agenda, to urge people in a certain way, to use various forms of influence, I think it ties to what we have talked about, is really important. And though even Colette's paper did that, I didn't mention that, but say the dynamic where the leader should articulate these goals, but then the followers have to give back. That's the interest. But this is a practical matter now that you all are revising your essays, and the content of the book is your stuff. So I invite you to think about these in ways that Steve has done, and I appreciate in your paper already think about these as leadership questions. Dan, to some extent, and many of you drew out in your remarks, how do we think about this, about not just conceptualizing things, but either addressing leaders with arguments or giving a vision of what that leadership would look like. Those are great. How would you take your feasibility skeptics and your address them and turn it into a leadership kind of angle?
Let me ask, why did you invite the group you invited? Most of us have no professional competence in leadership studies. You can go ahead for other reasons. David certainly works in that area, you guys do, but the rest of us look around the table. We can make our, I'm sorry, the Kennedy School, I should be more careful about this.
The translator, why on earth did you write these out?
Anyway, and obviously we want to change, we all want to change the world in some way or other, but we're not people that really know leadership. Can you say more about
Well,
why
I
you
would
invited
say,
this group?
and then I'll invite Gil and Thad to say something, but in a way, that's what this forum is about, is to draw scholars in the substantive fields of inquiry across disciplines to come together and talk about this precise issue. And in a way, it's a way of inviting you into this conversation of leadership as well. What does leadership look like on climate change, on health, and so forth, around on educational policy, on solidarity, on these different questions. And so there's that piece. But on the other hand, you are the expert, and you do know stuff about leadership, so we want to say, well, draw it out, and so it's about translation as well.
And I think there's also a danger, and as I suggested in leadership studies, it can be an isolated discipline.
Right.
It's disconnected from all of the things that we're talking about. So I think one of the steps forward is to bring the leadership studies, and I think Joseph Nye's book, Power to Lead, is a big step forward of somebody who made his reputation in international relations and the hard power, soft power, smart power distinction, and then going through the leadership studies and trying to sort it out in ways that are relevant for a larger audience. And I think that's something that all of us can be involved in, rather than a discipline that's isolated from the rest of the mainstream disciplines.
It's really important that these conversations inform leadership and particularly inform us. And I'll use an example of what Toddy and I did together. I have this book on leading change in multiple contexts, and one of the contexts was global. So I love Toddy's schema that she laid out for you today, and then she used that, she used the scenario and then her schema, and I then drew the leadership implications from that. For example, so if you have to take an issue with all these complex transnational or whatever issues in it, so what are the implications for the leadership role in this? As a convener, who gets invited to the table? What is the leadership role in who's left out? How does the leadership involved in this make sure that all the differences are there, and yet holds the tension of having people work through those? And so if you have a conversation like this, it helps me draw, well, okay, what does that mean for people in global leadership roles? How do they do that? What are the issues they have to grapple with? So that's why we invite all of you to the table, because this really helps us in many ways. It really informs us about leadership.
The other thing, I think I know the three of us agree, and probably almost everyone in the Jepson School would agree, we don't want to ever focus on leadership as simply being politicians and presidents and diplomats and people with power, but leadership is happening at multiple levels. And certainly, I think Jillian was incontrovertibly correct in claiming that one of the things that has to happen has to be global citizenship, and there has to be a sense of responsibility to some sort of global community, and that's it's a massive leadership task at often at very local levels to create citizens. And so I'm continually struck by your story about the Kennedy School students who couldn't even put a moral note into their their mock memo. This is the question: is what does it take to take that on? Is it something that has to happen, the moral formation of the person 10 years before, or is it something that faculty can help contribute to? I mean, that's certainly another task, because it's no good creating all the wonderful global leaders if there's no followers.
I wonder
Go along with
if,
it.
Matthias, you could write that into your chapter, and maybe not name names, although it's obvious where you teach, but that's an important story about training leaders and how hard it is to get a global consciousness and how we move from idealism into practicality, and people are stuck to say, well, the realist vision's the only one that counts, or something so.
Well, that's a general kind of follow-up observation on that story. It's if you think about what kind of impact do we as teachers, in particular teachers of philosophy, have that can be classified as leadership, right? And I guess in one sense one can be fairly optimistic there and say, of course we are, we have an impact on leadership, and we assume leadership. Leadership has something to do with persuading, with getting things changed, with getting people to change their minds about things. We have them in the classroom, right? We have a lot of opportunities, and all of us, I'm sure, have had this experience where we really see that a student went through a change process and was persuaded of something, and maybe changed their career plans and says, I want to work towards a certain good, right? So in that sense, I think we're doing just fine, when we're thinking of our involvement in leadership. But then I often despair then when it comes to at the more concrete level, right? So getting getting philosophical thought to bear on decision making, right, for real. And there I've recently been in a podium discussion on immigration, where I try to push a particular line of thought about how immigration policy is not something we can think of as privileges that we bestow on other people, right? So we have obligations, right? There are certain obligations to let people in, in certain ways, right, that can be described. But just to kind of get, and then people were really pushing back on this, like, this is really not going to have any impact on this debate. This is all. They came with economic arguments, right? They said, it's better for everybody under the following circumstances if we allow for more immigration, right? So there's this explicit response to that philosophical arguments don't fly, and of course that's exactly what we observe at the macro level, right? People they're not really interested, they're getting impatient with philosophical reasoning. There's, if you think about in particular the public discourse in the United States, right, where do you see, we have this subset of academic types called public intellectuals, right, who are mostly journalists who know a little bit more theory than other journalists, right? So in a way we have kind of academia, we have outsourced this a little bit, right? And we are not really, we're not really much part of this, right? When Bill Clinton was president, he occasionally had these get-togethers at the White House where people like Richard Rorty and Amy Gutman and some other people were hanging out, right? Things like that happen very rarely, right? So my story yesterday about the Kennedy School students was kind of, in a way, it's a token of extreme frustration that even in a mock exercise, ongoing policymakers would pay so little heed to this, even after they've gone through a full-length semester course on this, right? And anyway, so it's this kind of mixed picture here, right? On the one hand, strong confidence in our leadership roles in public discourse, and when it comes to this indirect influencing of future minds, but an increasing sense of despair as to what this concretely means.
But I think that we're not, we should avoid the picture of us being sort of on the outside of all of this and trying to influence it from the outside. I think oftentimes we're part of these currents that go through society and we articulate them. And so I think, we didn't invent global justice. I mean, it came before us. There was a growing sort of sentiment in the first world countries about an understanding of the situation, a growing sort of moral sense that there was some responsibility that we had for this, and eventually the global justice literature, I think, grew up as a way of articulating and specifying and clarifying our thought about this sort of thing, and I think it has had a real influence. There are real centers of thought that are organized around this. There's a lot of money behind this. There's billionaires who fund this stuff. There are institutions like the World Bank we don't always agree with what they do, but they're certainly influenced by these ideas. Guys like Sen have all kinds of their hands in everything, and so I think when you stick with the picture of us on the outside trying to change things, it's more it's an unhappy picture. But I think we're part of what we do is we articulate from the inside. We're part of these movements and hopefully channel them.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think ideas do play this tremendously important role. The example of Sen is a good one. So if you want to have ethical ideas that have an import, be an economist. And it's not necessarily the economic ideas that often do a lot, it's being an economist. So, I mean, the Stern Review is tremendously influential in framing climate discussions in the UK. One of the key variables here, as many people know, is how much you weigh future generations, which is an ethical decision. A huge respect must play to him because he's Nicholas Stern, and he's an economist of great stature and worked at the World Bank. So, and maybe business school as well is another source. So no matters who says these things, as well as the actual content. But can I just go back to something? I mean, to Julian's point, I felt embarrassed, with that I didn't talk of leadership more in my paper, but I kind of struggle with it because I was wondering, well, so how much? So this is a good practical question. How much do you want philosophy now, and how much do you not want it? Because a lot of, as I thought, the leadership issues are kind of to do with strategy and policy and framing. So let's take climate change. A lot of economists will say, look, you don't need global consciousness, you don't need this, you just need a well-functioning emissions trading market. Now, let's suppose empirically that's the case, right? Then leadership matters. What that means is just designing a scheme and preventing people from gaming the system. But what's doing the work is the empirics there. So it's quite hard to think, well, there's an ethics of leadership where you think there are responsibilities that accrue to leaders that don't accrue to other people. And then they have special justificatory burdens and they might have special duties in virtue of that. So, and in climate change that matters a lot because individuals often say it makes no difference whether or not I do it, but you can't be the President of the United States and say that, or in Congress. So I was wondering, how much do you want that kind of philosophical kind of stuff, and how much do you want more, well, to be a real leader on climate change, we have to invest in clean technology transfer, for example.
The other part of it is that the most important part of leadership, we start from the wrong end. The most important part of leadership is the purpose. I mean, you're not leading. Why lead if you don't have a really important purpose like global justice? And if you go back, I do a lot of work on invisible leadership, which comes out of Mary Parker Follett, who says that the leader is actually the purpose, the common purpose, and leaders and followers are following that. So we're talking about one of the most important common purposes that you can talk about. And leadership should come from that, not necessarily the other way around, where we think about, well, who is the leader and what are they doing? It's what are we leading and why?
Can I just also say something about leadership and what philosophy can do? It also seems to me that philosophers can have one sort of discussion where they try to aim to just get it right, whatever it is that's right, and then sometimes we have a discussion not about what's right, but more about okay, well, what can we get? What's the kind of argument that would get us sort of approximately right, but also really getting traction out there in the world? And I thought that several people talked about moral minimums of various sorts. So I thought Simon's paper was like this, and Jennifer's paper was like this. And they both sort of saying, well, look, there's a lot of things you can disagree about, but here's what a lot of people are gonna agree about or should agree about, and you can get a lot of mileage out of these ideas, which are going to gain wide sort of acceptance, and it's going to get some traction. And I think that part of leadership is getting the right arguments that leaders can use.
I mean, I think the philosophical stuff is tremendously important, partly because what Gil said, but partly because, leaders now thinking in a more conventional sense are persons who have multiple, often conflicting moral demands on them, and I think it's important to have some way to, or how to sort those out. Otherwise just get pulled and have no rudder. So I think the philosophy is very helpful. And it's really to answer some, if you want to talk about clean technology in the paper, yes, you can. And it's certainly it's part of a national strategy for leadership issues, sure.
But how do you see the emphasis, right?
Yeah.
So you could say, look, what we should be talking about is that from example, how the EU emissions trading scheme should be reformed post 2012. Right, that's to caricature one extreme there. The other one as well. So I think what the papers today are talking often was what you were describing. So what should leaders be aiming for? They kind of gave you the vision thing, and hopefully, and say, well, look, this is what. But it was more on that's what leaders should aim for rather than the emphasis being on leaders. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, one thing I was thinking, but this is, I don't know if it's changing, but the political psychology of leadership is always fascinating to me, especially in a democracy, especially in the US, it's very interesting. So, honestly, most people today, most Democrats, no one likes to be led, right? It's like being led by the nose, right? You know, you're being led, you're not really ruling your own life, you're being led, you're just being, you know, skirted. So what's the trick of democratic leadership is to actually be getting people to do things, governing their lives, but getting them to think that they're running their own lives. And that's
like a
actually
noble lie.
that's the way it works. That's how democratic politics works, right? And representation, the ideal of representation, is a brilliant way of hiding what's really happening, right? So the democratic leader says, no, but I'm representing you, you know, leads you up, but this is you. It's not me, this is you, you know.
Really?
So to me, that's always been endlessly fascinating, the political psychology of leadership, because it's not what it seems.
There's the classical analysis of presidential power in the United States. There's a book by Richard Newstead called something like the American Presidency, right, which actually strongly emphasizes this, particularly that in this system of division of power, the president, you know, what the president can actually do, the leadership of the president, really doesn't primarily come by ordering people to do something, but by creating an environment where people, you know, feel that this is what they want to do, where they feel empowered to go ahead with this, where they are persuaded in ways that are not obvious to them, right? So having a kind of presence that brings us about, and he actually spells this out in very intriguing ways. That's why the book is, you know, still widely read, because there's still tremendously much to be learned from the different dimensions of this account that he has.
There's also this social movement theory, and you know, this work that they talk about norm entrepreneurs and the process of internalizing norms and how you do that, and you know, that's something we actually didn't talk very much about today, but I think is relevant to this whole issue.
Can you teach that?
Yeah, well, I'd have to, I mean, you know, I don't think leadership studies has this core fixed, you know, Bible. But certainly, if you want resources for things to look at that would help you to revise in papers, you definitely ask us. And one thing that just been published, Sage has published like a 2-volume encyclopedia of political leadership, which covers an enormous amount of topics, including social movement theory and lots of other stuff as well. So, you know, it's $400, so don't buy it, but maybe your library can. But I'm serious, if you want a quick snip, you know, something to get your juices flowing. But I won't, there's no leadership theory would force me, but that's a resource. You've got other things that would help you, you know, ask us, and maybe we can suggest a couple of things.
I recommend the book by our colleague Terry Price. Just did a book on Cambridge called Leadership Ethics, and it goes through Kantianism, consequentialism, social contract, what else, virtue, and so forth, theory by theory, 8 of them, and looks at the questions of justification and privilege and special status that leaders have, and he ends up arguing a Kantian line, but it's a really wonderful question on some of these questions. How are leaders different?
Yeah.
And what are they justified in doing that's different? What responsibilities do they have that are different? But that's a great resource. But just the last thing I would say, to close here, is that the more you can be reflective in these directions, all the ones that you've raised about how leaders and citizens would work to achieve some of the goals that we've talked about, even as you talk about the important goals of global justice or the ends of global justice. I think the more interesting this volume is, the more it is about leadership, and the more it will cohere. So, but thanks, and you know, we could do it a whole other day. You want to come back tomorrow and talk about the leadership angle some more?
I just want to thank all of you again for coming. It's really a privilege for Doug and I have all these cool people, some of whom we know, some we haven't known, but all of you familiar with work, and get to see you person, and it's a lot more fun than the usual weekend of preparing for a class. So thanks for coming. We're looking forward to building on this and producing a great book. Thanks again, especially to Nancy Knock for organizing this international conference from her office.
You see the fancy black van is out there.
Yeah.
So,
Let's quick enter.
proceed, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that was, no, this is our RE, I mean, most
Hey, Thad,
yeah, sure, that's good.
can you turn off the,
Yeah.
can you hit stop on
Yes.
the end system?
I don't.
Thank you for your